The Siege of Honobia is a local legend that has captured the imagination of many who enjoy tales of mystery and the unknown. Honobia is a small, rural community nestled in the dense forests of southeastern Oklahoma, known for its lush greenery and rich wildlife. However, it's also infamous for its tales of Bigfoot sightings. The story of the siege is one of the most chilling accounts in the area's folklore, recounting a night when a family's home came under attack by these elusive creatures. The setting. The story is set in the fall of 2000, as the leaves began to turn a fiery array of reds and oranges, casting the dense forest around Honobia in an eerie glow. The Carter family, who had moved to a remote cabin in the woods a few years earlier, had always been drawn to the isolation and tranquility of rural life. Their cabin was a modest wooden structure surrounded by thick pine trees, miles away from the nearest neighbor. Over the years, the Carters had become familiar with the sounds of the forest. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of leaves under a deer's feet, and the chirping of crickets were all common and comforting sounds. But recently, there had been stranger noises. Low, guttural growls and the snapping of branches had unnerved the family, especially when they noticed that these sounds would grow louder and closer after dark. Occasionally, they found large, unidentifiable footprints in the mud around their property. This was unsettling, but they brushed it off as a bear or some other large animal, despite the odd shape of the prints. The first encounter one crisp October evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the family dog, Rocky, began to bark furiously at the edge of the woods. Rocky was usually calm, but tonight his barks were frantic and aggressive, unlike anything the Carters had heard before. Thomas Carter, the father, stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun in hand, peering into the darkness. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the typical night sounds eerily absent. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from behind the cabin. The sound of something heavy slamming against the wooden walls made the entire family jump. Thomas rushed back inside, locking the door behind him. His wife, Mary, grabbed their two children and huddled them into a corner of the living room, whispering words of comfort despite her own rising panic. The banging continued, growing more intense with each hit. Windows rattled and the cabin's wooden frame creaked under the strain. Thomas peered out through a crack in the boarded-up window, and his heart froze. Standing just at the edge of the tree line, illuminated by the dim light of the setting sun, was a massive figure covered in dark, matted fur. It stood on two legs, its eyes reflecting an eerie yellow glow. As Thomas's eyes adjusted, he realized there was not just one figure, but several. Their silhouettes loomed in the darkness, shifting and moving with purpose. The attacks began. The assault on the cabin intensified as the creatures began throwing rocks and sticks against the walls. The family could hear low growls and grunts outside, along with the heavy thud of footsteps circling the house. Thomas shouted at them to go away, firing a warning shot into the air, but the sound only seemed to agitate the creatures further. The battering on the walls grew more forceful, and the window shutters began to splinter under the barrage. Mary whispered a prayer under her breath, clutching the children tightly. The family had never felt more isolated. They were trapped in their own home, surrounded by something unknown, something angry. The only light in the cabin came from a small oil lamp on the table, casting long shadows on the walls that seemed to dance with every blow to the cabin's exterior. For hours, the attacks continued. The creatures showed no signs of tiring, their assaults relentless and coordinated, as if testing the family's defenses. Every now and then, there was a pause, a brief moment of terrifying silence, followed by a new wave of attacks. It was during one of these pauses that Thomas decided to take a risk. He crept towards the window with his rifle, aiming it at the largest figure he could see through the crack. He took a deep breath and fired. The shot rang out through the night, followed by a deafening roar of pain and fury. The creatures retreated momentarily, their growls echoing in the night. But soon they returned with renewed vigor, slamming against the cabin with more force than ever. The long night. As the hours dragged on, fatigue began to set in for the Carters. The children had fallen asleep in Mary's arms, their faces streaked with tears. Thomas, too, was exhausted, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down. The creatures continued to test the windows and doors, looking for a way inside. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the cabin. A part of the wall had splintered under the relentless pounding. Thomas rushed over and braced a chair against the damaged area, his heart racing. Outside, the sounds of the creatures grew louder and more frenzied. Thomas realized with a sinking feeling that they were communicating with each other, coordinating their efforts. He had heard stories of Bigfoot from the locals, tales of large, hairy creatures roaming the woods, but he had never believed them. Now, he was facing what seemed to be an entire pack of them. Hours passed like days. The family remained huddled together, praying for dawn. Every creak of the cabin, every shadow that passed by the window, made their hearts race. The sounds of the creatures never ceased, sometimes moving further away, only to return moments later with a renewed ferocity. The relentless pounding on the walls and windows was terrifying, but it was the sounds they made, the guttural growls, the sharp barks, and the occasional chilling scream that kept the family in a state of constant dread. The dawn breaks. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, the sounds outside began to change. The creatures' growls became softer, and the pounding on the cabin walls subsided. Thomas peered out the window again, just in time to see the dark silhouettes retreating into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if they had never been there. The family waited, holding their breath, listening to the silence that had replaced the chaos. The sun slowly rose, casting warm, golden light through the windows, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they felt a glimmer of hope. Cautiously, Thomas opened the front door and stepped outside, his rifle at the ready. The yard was a mess. Rocks, broken branches, and large footprints were scattered everywhere. The ground was torn up, and parts of the cabin's walls were scratched and dented. It was clear that the creatures had been trying to get inside, testing every point of entry, but they had somehow managed to hold them off. Mary and the children slowly emerged, blinking in the morning light, still in shock, but relieved to be alive. They stood in silence for a moment, taking in the damage. Thomas knew they couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever those creatures were, they were intelligent and persistent. He had heard enough stories from the locals to know that this was no ordinary animal encounter. They needed to leave to find safety elsewhere. The aftermath. The Carters packed their belongings quickly, taking only what they could carry. As they drove away from the cabin, the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the dirt road. The family didn't look back. They drove to the nearest town and found shelter with friends, still shaken by the night's events. Word of the Siege of Honobia spread quickly through the small community, becoming a local legend almost overnight. Some believed the Carters, while others dismissed their story as a wild exaggeration. However, those who ventured near the old Carter cabin after the event spoke of a strange feeling in the air, a heavy presence that seemed to linger among the trees. To this day, the cabin remains abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The story of the siege has become a part of Honobia's folklore, a tale told around campfires and whispered in hushed tones. Some say that on quiet nights, when the wind is still, you can hear the distant sound of rocks being thrown and low growls echoing through the woods, a reminder of the night when the creatures of the forest laid siege to the small cabin in Honobia.